As we mark an important milestone, I cannot think of a better way to launch this lecture series than by turning to an extraordinary leader of higher education, who observed when we presented him with the Foreign Policy Association Medal 2 years ago, that to address global challenges from climate change to poverty, quote, universities, not the government, not the private sector, but universities are the one institution we can count on. Lee Bollinger became Columbia University's 19th president in 2002. Under his leadership, Columbia stands at the very top rank of great research universities, distinguished by comprehensive academic excellence, historic institutional development, and an innovative and sustainable approach to global engagement. President Bollinger is a member of the Columbia Law School faculty and one of the country's foremost First Amendment scholars. Each fall semester, he teaches freedom of speech and press to Columbia undergraduate and graduate students. His most recent book, Uninhibited, Robust, and Wide Open, A Free Press for a New Century, has placed him at the center of public discussion about the importance of global free speech to continued social and political progress. Among President Bollinger's signal achievements at Columbia are the development of a network of 8 Columbia Global Centers on 4 continents and the creation of new venues on the university's home campus supporting global conversations and scholarship. In the age of globalization, the prospects for peace and prosperity are greatly enhanced by institutions of higher learning that prepare graduates to be at home in the world and to be capable of contributing to solutions for challenges on a global scale. At the Foreign Policy Association, we salute your vision, and we are honored to have you grace our forum. President Bollinger, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Noel. I appreciate that. It is a really great honor for me to be giving this first Centennial lecture. It's an amazing thing to me to be standing here before you and doing this. I have great admiration, of course, for the Foreign Policy Association, for Noel and what he has done, and for all of you, and especially, I would say, the teachers in the room whom I know have gathered here for a week to take advantage of the programming and education of the Foreign Policy Association. This institution was established at a moment in time that we all look back on with a sense of missed opportunities, of great human loss, of the formation of the attempt to form a world that, in retrospect, we have to say it was something that was missed. And then there's the post-World War II period and the institutions that were created in part because of what was done and not done in this period right around World War I and now to today. And I actually want to try to draw these themes together in my talk to you this evening. There were many things that were created in this 1917, 1918, 1919, not only the Foreign Policy Association. The core curriculum at Columbia was established. It's really the only core curriculum that exists in the United States at any university. Contemporary civilization is the core of the core. The idea behind it was that young people who are going to be the next generation of leaders need to be exposed to the great texts, the great minds of history, but to do so in small settings at the very outset of their college career, 22 other students, to engage with text with a mind who was not an expert. I mean, it was a really brilliant idea. So not somebody who's an expert on Socrates or someone who's an expert on Montaigne or Shakespeare or Virginia Woolf, but somebody who is very, very, very talented and smart, an expert in something else, who with these young people, 18, 19 years old, is struggling to make sense of these texts. And then the last part, to do it in the context of thinking about modern issues, contemporary issues, hence contemporary civilization. It's an idea that expanded out. We have literature in humanities, music in humanities, and so on and so on. But the core curriculum was created at this particular moment out of a sense, just like this organization, that the world needed to try to think about issues in the context of great ideas, great minds, and so on. It is also the moment in which the Pulitzer Prizes were created. We just spent a year celebrating that. Obviously, the sense of responsibility of journalism to educate the public is behind that. And it is the moment when the First Amendment is created. Every year, as Noel said, I teach a course to undergraduates called Freedom of Speech and Press, and I teach it just as I would a law school class, so I use a case book. And the very first cases interpreting the First Amendment out of the Supreme Court are not in 1850 or 1760 or 80, or they're 1919, and they come out of this period when there is this sense that there is a modern world, evolving global world, and we have to make sense of it, and freedom of speech and press are part of it, but we have no cases before then. And so it means a lot to me to think about that little period of time and what was created. I want to acknowledge Terry Checky, a very dear friend, but it's somebody I think extremely highly of from my time with the New York Federal Reserve Bank Board, and somebody who's been involved in the very thing I want to talk about tonight. So I'm going to take advantage of this moment, and I'm not going to give a speech. What I'm going to do is to try to take you through the thinking of a great university, Columbia, and those of us who have struggled with trying to understand how to make sense of a university's role in the modern world. And there are several parts to what I want to talk about. I want to say, go very quickly, but I want to talk first about how do we understand universities. I just want to say some general things about the greatness of our universities. I want to say how they're out of alignment with the modern world. And I want to say what the response of that has been, the responses to that being out of alignment. And I want to say something about how the world is out of alignment. Our institutions are not in proper structure and form and capacity to deal with the world problems. And the last thing I want to talk about is how universities have a responsibility to come forward and to help, and to what that might look like, and then a series of questions that one would ask once one says universities should play a bigger role in the world. Well, how would you do that? What would be the implications of that? So that's the basic structure. And let me begin with universities. I think it's indisputable that much, if not most all, of what we take for granted as the benefits of modern life originate in the research of our great universities. It's extraordinary what has been discovered through our university system over the past 100 years. They are not only the great generator of new ideas and new knowledge, but they're extremely successful in taking every new generation through this body of knowledge in the context of research on great new ideas and preparing them for a world. It is a system that has flaws. We all know there is criticism of universities, but of all the institutions, at least in the United States, I think universities stand out for their integrity and for their accomplishments. All that said, they are organized in an extremely bizarre way. No sane person, if presented with the problem, go design an American university, would come up with the system that we have. So what is that system? The system is basically taking extremely smart and talented, gifted young people, watching them for a few years, and then giving them a job for life. And that's called tenure, as you know. And not only giving them a job for life, but also giving them extraordinary autonomy over that life. So when I was a young law professor at age 27, I thought it was genius to give me this life. I felt I had no boss. I've never had a boss in the sense of somebody like a dean or a university president telling me it's time to teach this, or that you should do research in this problem rather than that problem, or maybe you should design your career in this way. Individual faculty, subject to a lot of pressure, so it's not completely free of any kind of influence, but nevertheless, individual faculty have extraordinary autonomy over their lives. Somehow it works. People get up every day, they go teach their classes, they do their research, they discover new ideas, they advance knowledge, and it's an incredibly vibrant community, but as I said, organized in a very bizarre way. The second thing that's important to know about universities is that they have to be aligned with problems of humanity and the world. You can't be, this of course varies depending upon the school, the discipline, the department that you're in. You can't be completely divorced from any concern about from humanity. Otherwise, you will lose the trust of the public and the benefits that you have of this autonomy, and you will have meaningless kinds of discussions and research. But you can't be so involved in the day-to-day issues like the journalist is. You cannot be that involved and do what you need to do, which is to think about important problems in a reflective kind of way, nonpartisan, non-ideological, but you're supposed to think about the long term. So you have to be not too close and not too far away. You have to be in alignment. So universities are an incredible success story, organized in a very weird way, but successful and have to be in some alignment. My second thesis is that we're not in proper alignment with the world as it is. When I started as, again, a law professor, the world was undergoing, the United States was undergoing massive changes. I became a professor in 1973. I came to law school in 1968. I was influenced by the enormous issues of the time. The civil rights movement, freedom of speech was born in this period. I mean, really, the modern jurisprudence on free speech starts in 1919, but it's really the cases of the 1960s. New York Times versus Sullivan, Cohen versus California, a number of other cases. Constitutional law was the prism through which every major U.S. problem was thought about. Someone like me wanted to go into constitutional law and did so. In 1960, if you went to law school, you took one course on American constitutional law. By the time I was a law professor in the 1970s, up say in 1980, there was now not just one course on constitutional law, but a dozen, 24. Even the First Amendment is special. I teach freedom of speech and press. I don't do religion. I don't do freedom of assembly or freedom of petition. Those are other professors who do that. And then there's professors who do the Fourth Amendment, criminal procedure, and professors who do the 14th Amendment, and people who do separation of powers. The field was subdivided because the world changed, and one course on American constitutional law was not enough. Regional studies were created in the 1950s and 60s because the United States realized we needed expertise in other parts of the world. So the great centers of study of China, Soviet Union, et cetera, were created in this period. I watched that happen. But today, the world has changed so radically, so quickly, that American universities have not themselves adjusted to this new world. There are many examples. Take my own field, which I can speak about with authority. The world is no longer, in communications, free speech terms, only a U.S. system. It's not bounded by our own system, and then there's international human rights. It's now a global communications system where Europe decides that the right of privacy outweighs the interest in free discussion about people's lives, and they create a right to be forgotten. And they're not happy if the right to be forgotten is only enforced in Europe. It has to be expunged from the servers and everything based in the United States. That impacts the United States. I can give countless examples where we are now in a global freedom of expression, free speech world, and yet my field is still thinking about the world as if it's the United States. So all of my casebook, everything I teach, is all directed at the United States, and then we leave to the international human rights people all the other stuff. It just doesn't make sense anymore. I'll give you one other example. You ask any person in the Foreign Policy Association world, what's the most important thing that we need to attend to over the next 50 years, 100 years? Clearly, China and what happens to it is right up there in the top 3 or 5. How good is our knowledge and expertise about China relative to the significance of that question? I would argue it's not even close. Our knowledge about China is unbelievably thin at almost every level compared to the significance of what happens to China and its impact on the world. There are many causes for why the world has changed so radically. I identify 3: the creation of the global economy, the rise of exports, the foreign investments, et cetera. Secondly, the global communications system, so it's no longer internal within countries. And thirdly, the mobility of people, not just refugees, but people in every way. This has reshaped the world in just 10, 20 years, and our knowledge, our intellectual framework in universities is not in the game, as it were, as much as it should be. We need to shift. So that leads to a discussion that is, in somewhat banal terms, called globalization in universities. What should we do? There are 3 responses that universities have brought to this. The first response is to say we're already very global, very international. Give countless examples of faculty who do work in the international sphere. We just need to do more of it. So just give more money and more resources to individuals and institutes and so on. My personal view is that that's not enough. We actually are not as global as that argument presumes. I can't go into it now, but that's the first argument. Yes, globalization is real. We're already global. Just give us more resources. We'll be more global. Second response or second theory to deal with globalization, the change of the world, is to set up branch campuses around the world. You have your faculty, you have your students. They are really campuses, but they are around the world. There's a theory behind this, very interesting, that it will have an impact on the world. It will also teach us more about the world because our faculty and our students will go through these institutions and will have a kind of collective global university. My own view is that is not going to work. I don't think it's wrong. I just think that it doesn't deal with the underlying problem. What happens is that on those branch campuses, they get separate faculty. The faculty at the home institution don't really want to go there. They may go for a while, but then you have trouble getting a cohort of faculty. You have separate students. Pretty soon you have, I think, an inferior institution, actually, relative to your home institution. But the main objection I have is that it really doesn't change the home institution. It ends up being separate and discrete. I'm overstating that because I think there's a lot to be said for the branch campus theory, but that's my critique. The third response is the one that we've come up with at Columbia, and that is to have presences around the world. I think you do have to have space, offices, people, etc., to facilitate your faculty and students engaging with the world. And that's what we've done with 8 global centers that Noel referred to. We've also set up programs at these centers, partnerships. It's a network. It's not just individual offices and places. And it's an effort to try to engage our scholarship, our education, out in the world. So that's where things sort of rest. Now here's something new. I've said universities are not in alignment with what's happening in the world. I would argue every institution I know of is not in alignment with where the world is. So if you look at the international organizations, the UN, etc., seems to me they struggle mightily with a world that just doesn't match the way they're put together. Completely understandable. They were set up in the post-World War II era. The same is true of the structure of our economic organizations, the World Bank, and so on. I think it's also true of think tanks. I think it's true of foundations. I think it's true of governments and democracies. We are not finding that our institutions, state, international, civil society, are organized and oriented in ways capable of dealing with the world that we are creating through these other means of economic activity, technological changes, and the way human beings are interacting. Big claim, don't have time to develop it in great depth, but my point is the world is struggling through its institutions to come to terms with a set of problems that are massive and need attention. Climate change is the most obvious, but there are many, many others. That's why I think there's a very special responsibility on universities to become more involved in the world, not just through research, not just through education, but through trying to organize ourselves to have an impact on the world, to actually do things. This is a big change for universities. to think about a university as not only a place of individual faculty, schools, disciplines doing their basic work, but as institutions dedicated to also having an impact on the world, in engaging with the world, in trying to develop solutions to problems. That's a new mission for a university. If you ask, what are the missions of a university? They're always threefold. Research, education, public service, kind of volunteer, we should be out helping. This is engagement with the world. This is actually trying to solve things. So how would you do that? Well, I think first of all, in order to really have an impact in the world, you have to be more organized in the academic world. It's not to say the individual faculty member and the individual school shouldn't continue in that way. As I said, it's incredibly successful. But we're missing a potential of universities to do things in a way that will respond to bigger problems by being more organized. There are great examples of this. The Manhattan Project is one. Another one is in physics, CERN. So the great machine in Switzerland makes it possible for physicists to answer questions they couldn't otherwise, but only if they organize in teams of dozens and hundreds, and people who did work in a much more isolated, individualistic way are now part of groups. It's possible to do this. You have to ask a lot of questions about it. How do you do it? How do you provide incentives? Will there be people? But I think the answers to those are yes. Then we can't be so competitive. So Columbia competes with Harvard. It competes with Stanford. It competes with NYU. Columbia is in a world that competes. But what if we didn't compete? But we said the problems of the world are too big to have that competition dominate everything we do. Let's see if we worked together. Then you would need to have outside partners, because one of the things we don't do very well is have influence or power in the world. We just don't have that power. But what if we said to the world, we're ready to engage with partners, governments, the commercial sector, the economic, the business sector, the financial sector, NGOs, etc., to work together on problems. Not just we do the research, hand it over to you, you go try to make it happen. But we work from the beginning, designing the research, designing the knowledge, and you as the influence, but we're going to influence your capacity to influence. You're going to have an influence on our research. Then you need to think about what problems are worthy of that kind of effort. And finally, we think you have to identify solutions. Things that you think you are going to try to accomplish. Ambitious, but not ridiculous. Something that you can really say, this is what we're going to try to do, and we're going to try to do it in a time frame. 5 years, we say. Not 20 years, not 100 years. There's plenty of space for that. What we need is effort to try to deal with problems now, working with outside partners. We're calling this Columbia World Projects. And I've announced it at Columbia. We're launching it. It's underway. The trustees have unanimously endorsed this at Columbia. We are setting up our home in Manhattanville, the new campus in West Harlem. We are on course for this. It is a big transition. As I said, it is adding a mission to the university. Lastly, what questions would you ask about this? The most obvious question is this something universities should do? My answer is, well, we're already doing it. If you go up to the medical center at Columbia, you'll find basic researchers who are trying to advance knowledge about human biology, pharmaceutical contributions, etc. Then you'll go right across the street and you'll find people operating on you, and you'll find people treating people. We have a combination of basic research and practical doing, finding solutions, practical things, right within our medical. So that's the way they're organized. The equivalent would be if we set up law schools according to a 1,000-person law firm plus the research that people would do. We don't do that. But we could. Individual faculty frequently do this. They work on their research, but then they try to work with outside partners. That's great. We sometimes form institute centers to do this. We commercialize our work. That's been going on for 3 decades. This is not completely foreign to universities, doing things in the world. What is foreign is having a university say it's now a mission of the institution to do this. We will make it as important as anything else we do. Will it corrupt or undermine the basic mission? I don't think so. I could argue at length about that. Will it violate the principle that we are supposed to be nonpartisan or not ideological? Big question, very important, very complicated. My view is, our view is, there's plenty of space for doing good in the world without being partisan. And so we should be attentive to that, but not let us stop it. What counts as a solution? Is this different from what other institutions are doing? If it's not different, so what? We need more help. That's the key. But I think it is different because it's rooted in a university. Is it something that we should only focus on things that are very concrete? We don't know yet. We think there's room for the arts. We think there's definitely room for the humanities. We think changing the way people think about things should count as a solution. This is all to be worked out. The key is, are we ready as universities to be more engaged in the world and to make the structures for that to happen? So that's the outline of the thesis. Universities are great. They must be in alignment. We're not in perfect alignment. We're taking a variety of steps to get in alignment. There are different views about that. But the world's not in alignment, and we need universities more, and we should be ready to help. Thanks very much for listening to me.
President Bollinger has graciously agreed to take a few questions. Right there.
I work very closely, especially with the students at SEPA as interns. But and my husband had several degrees from Columbia, and one was one of their most outstanding scholars. In any case, I think the most important thing that a university like Columbia could do is see that across the curriculum that students become engaged, that they are aware of the world about them, that I don't have only students from SEPA who are interested in sustainability and renewable energy, but it should be in every one of the faculties. I think we're politically in the United States in a very critical state, and it is because the students who are so well educated do not take leadership positions for our country, for democracy, for politics.
Well, I think, certainly making a greater effort to educate students at all levels and in all parts of the university about the great issues of the time, I think is fundamental. The core curriculum is built around that idea. Always debates about what really counts as a great text. Is it to Western civilization? Should it be wider, and so on? There are great debates about this, but that's the philosophy. Columbia, by its New York City presence, by its history, its intellectual character, is one of the most international, globally conscious universities. that exist. I mean, that's why I can say the things I'm saying, because we would not think of them, I think, in this way in another context. But we can clearly do more to educate students broadly about the world. I'll give an example. Under the classic model of a university, student comes, takes the courses, junior year, you study abroad. Come back, finish your degree, and go on. In your junior year, when you take that study abroad, where do you go? The overwhelming number go to Europe, London. I did myself. I mean, everybody wants to spend a semester in Paris in their junior year. And I think we all would say, that's great, there's nothing wrong with that, but that's not really a global. You're not becoming globally conscious when you structure your life. We have to provide many other opportunities. That shouldn't just be the junior year. It should be possible for students to work on projects all over the world, and especially in modern communications, to be much more fluid in their travel and what they're thinking about. We actually think of Columbia World Projects as offering an incredible educational opportunity for students to do that. And we're just beginning to try to design something along those lines. Your last point actually is something I agree with deeply, which is I worry very, very much about the way the political world is alienating for many highly educated people who want to do public service. And that's, I think, a very big problem in the country.
Is Columbia the only university that's embracing this new initiative?
Yes, no, I think every university would say we're deeply committed to being more involved in the world. And so it may be I don't think it's semantics. I think saying that we're going to make it a mission of the university elevates it to a different level. But I think, universities do understand that becoming more engaged is a priority.
Sir. Thanks for honoring us with elevated and second-order contribution. At a time when civil society itself and its pillars such as universities, press, courts are under attack, per se, can you talk about, because you certainly thought about it, the role of universities and what they should do to push back about the fabric of civil society per se, and for that matter, while you're on it, the subject of truth and whether there is such a thing as truth in the world of deconstructionism?
So I'm happy to talk about deconstructionism, but the first part of the question I want to make sure I've got. Say it again, the fabric of civil society, or?
There are those who are devaluing courts, press.
Oh, I see.
Per se, there are those who say if you go to university, you'll become a liberal, and then what'll happen?
I got it. Right.
The question is, and Sean Hannity sneers at Harvard every night, and so there's the question.
Right. So I have a number of things to say about this. I do think very much, I want to say right at the beginning, maintaining the trust of the American public and the global public in our universities is a very high concern and order. And it really bothers me when people speak about how universities are not conscious of the costs of higher education for young people. And when universities are criticized for being intolerant and allowing anti-free speech things to occur on the campuses. It bothers me when universities are criticized for being too liberal and not open to other ideas. These are things we need to attend to. When I talk about Columbia World Projects, one of the thoughts I have in my mind is maintaining engagement with the world as a way of establishing for the public how important universities are. So let me give an example. So we have two projects that we're in the process of possibly going with at the beginning. Both very exciting, but I'm going to just focus on one in the interest of time. We know that sequencing the human genome is something that 15 years ago cost billions of dollars. Now you can do it for $1,000. Very soon, every one of us, when we walk into a hospital, there'll be a blood sample taken some way, and our genome will be sequenced. The people who do this and the people who know about it, who are experts, are predicting, and I think it's a credible prediction, that this will lead to a revolution in diagnosis of disease and treatment, as well as understanding humanity in many ways. So we're at the beginning of a revolution in medicine. And more broadly, the problem we face is that over 90% of the knowledge we have about the human genome is from Northern European descent people like me. So those of us who are in that category will benefit disproportionately and will be limited in our capacity to understand generally. We need to make the beginning of this revolution more inclusive, fair, etc. We think about taking on a project of trying to help make that happen, not only in this country, but in other countries around the world. President Obama already started a little program on this, a significant program. We are part of that for Upper Manhattan. But this is something where a university has no interest other than fairness, and we should take this on. And 20 years from now, we could look back and say, the revolution in medicine through genetic sequencing was fair because we stepped in to try to work with partners to create this. That's a way, in my view, of reestablishing trust between us and the public. I can give other examples. We live in a very sad time. I mean, there's just no way other than to say, nothing to say other than this. The attacks on scientific evidence, on scientists, on science, on facts, on integrity of people, innuendos, smear campaigns. I mean, this is absolutely beneath the American values and norms that the country has fought for centuries. There's just no way to be at a university and not say we have a responsibility to speak about this. We have a responsibility. This is not partisan. I don't care what political party you're part of, but if you deny the essential elements of truth that have been established over time, and I do believe, every person has to decide for themselves, do you believe in things called truth, or is there no truth? Well, I'm in the things can be true side. When you have that as your core mission, truth, simple to say, obvious, incredibly important. When you have that as your core mission, absolutely you need to speak out about this and to try to do things to help correct it. So on the other hand, we're just one institution or some institutions. There seem to be things happening in the world that are very large and very disturbing and very frightening. But every institution, every person has to do what they can.
We have time for one more question. Very back.
Thank you. I was just thinking about, the role that universities can play to impact the world, more. And
impacts the world more?
Yeah, and I was just wondering your thoughts, what your thoughts are on the role technocrats should play in government, because very often there are politicians that are not well versed in certain matters and misinform the public, and then there are people that know the subject matter but don't exactly know how to break it down
Right.
in a way that the public can understand. So how do you balance this responsibility to, educate and, perform research, public service with the whole, political aspect of it, not become overly partisan, but also, educating the public. Thank
Let
you.
me try to answer several things packed in there. One is, I have to say, technocratic government sounds awfully good right now. I'd take that in a second. Usually we think about technocratic as understanding the cost-benefit analysis of this, but lacking a human vision and a human sensitivity, and that's how we use the term typically. I think it's a fascinating question. How do you, for an educator, for somebody, how do you educate people to that? How do you create an environment that is both highly respectful of analysis and rationality, and respect for things can be counterintuitive and true, with a sense of humanity and a caring, empathy. That's of course something that just goes right to the heart of what I think a university tries to do. I know one of the things that's on your mind, so let me use it as the example. Free speech is one of the issues on American campuses. And there is a concern that there is a hypersensitivity among young people about engaging in open debate, so that there's safe spaces, they want to be protected against this. And there's a concern that universities are giving into that and abandoning the free speech principles that we've established over the past 100 years. My view is it's really not true. Some examples, very egregious examples of this have happened, but it's actually not widespread. We've had many very controversial speakers come to Columbia and gone without incident and without being publicly noticed. That's part of the media's problem on this. Nevertheless, every single person needs to come to the conclusion on their own that free speech is worth, as we've defined it, is worth living with. Freedom of speech, as we define it, is not intuitive. It is counterintuitive. Nobody likes to go around confronting people who are shouting at you, who are very angry, who want to engage. It's very, very normal to want to silence people who are highly critical of you. And Holmes said this 100 years ago. In that case, intolerance is perfectly normal. That's where we start. That's why it's hard. That's why it's taken centuries to get to the point. So how do you educate people to do that? Not just the university students, but a whole society. Courts have a very significant role to play. Universities have to find ways to talk about this. The limits of speech, exactly where we are always open for debate, in my view. If you look at that 100 years of jurisprudence on free speech, we've gone every direction. 1919, I told you, was when the cases started. One of the people who was put in jail, and the Supreme Court said, for speech, and the Supreme Court said it's just fine, doesn't violate the First Amendment, was a candidate for President of the United States, Eugene Debs. He just gave a speech in Ohio praising people who resisted the draft. He was arrested, put in jail. This went to the Supreme Court. Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote the opinion for for the unanimous court. This does not violate the First Amendment. Within a year or two, Holmes began to say, maybe that's not right. And from that moment until Today, we've developed a very different view, but it's hard. How do you do that with empathy, with sympathy? Some people, some groups are going to suffer more than others because of this free speech doctrine. We should not kid ourselves that it's all just easy to live with the kind of, and it's always open for debate. So how do you talk about this in a meaningful way in an environment that does not want to talk about it in a complex, meaningful way? That's what a university does best, and that's what I think we're all proud of to be part of. Noel, thank you very much.
Thank you.